Joining us today for the first installment of our On the Clock series on the Athletic Football Show. It is a first-time guest, which I am not sure how it took this long, but I'm very happy to have him on the show today. It's Jordan Reid from ESPN. Jordan, how you doing, man?
I'm good. I'm not going to hold it against you, man. I've been a long-time listener of the show, and I've always enjoyed it, so it's a pleasure being on here.
I will say, for the most part, because we have Dane in the hopper, the guests for the draft part of the year are not quite as important as the guests for the rest of the year. But obviously, Dane has a lot of things that he has to worry about, and we're doing more draft shows this year than we did last year. So very happy to use that space to incorporate a lot of the draft voices that I respect around the space, and very happy to get you involved. And you're the guinea pig of sorts here, because we are starting off this series of shows. We've never done this before. This is a slight tweak on a concept we tried last year. It's always a little trial and error, right? You learn lessons whenever you trot something out for the first time. We went back to the drawing board. We watched the tape, and there were some things that we wanted to do a little bit differently this year, and I think this is going to go a little bit more smoothly. For everyone who listened to the intro, you know the rules here. We're going to go through every team in the first round over the next 5 weeks. We're going to break it up into 5 separate shows. We're going to give Jordan 3 options for each team that we're going to talk about here, picking 1 through 6 in the draft, and you are going to pick one of the 3 options I give you. You're allowed to push back on this, by the way. If the 3 options are unsatisfactory, if I didn't do a good enough job, you can get upset and we can talk about what else you would want to do with these picks. So don't feel boxed in by the concept.
I'll blame you for not working the phones good enough on draft day if I don't like the trade back option.
So that's another part of this. And again, I mentioned this a little bit in the intro. We are going to do some trades in this show, but in order to make sure that we don't lose the plot entirely and we don't go full multiverse where there's different things happening across the entire draft and we have to account for them, the butterfly effect, keeping it in check, the only trades that are going to be allowed are trades within these picks. And that makes a lot of sense for the top 5 more than some of the other ones, but that's the one thing we're going to have to fudge here because trades are fun, but I don't want to send this spiraling in a direction where we totally don't have a handle on it anymore.
I got you. That works for me.
Let's start with the Tennessee Titans, who own the number 1 pick in the draft. They sent everyone involved with the history of their organization to Cam Ward's pro day today, so maybe sending a little bit of a signal about what they want to do with the number 1 overall pick. Here are your 3 options for the Tennessee Titans, who are now on the clock at number 1. Option 1, draft Cam Ward with the first pick. Seems like a reasonable thing to do at this point. Option 2, this is our first trade scenario. You can trade the first overall pick to the Giants for numbers 3, 34, and a 2026 second-round pick. If option 2, then we'll talk about the Giants. We can flip that a little bit. For option 3, which is, maybe a little bit further off the beaten path, but we'll consider it here, you take Abdul Carter with the number 1 overall pick. With those 3 options, what are you doing if you're the Tennessee Titans?
I'm taking the quarterback, Robert, and I mean, it's simple. Like, you don't have a lot of opportunities to have the number 1 overall pick, and it's been interesting over the past month or so, and I even put this in my mock draft. Like, all of the steam coming out of the combine was that they're shopping the pick. They want to move out of number 1 if they don't take Abdul Carter at the top, and I even had the exact same trade scenario that you proposed to me with the second option. Instead, I had a third-round pick instead of a second-round pick in 2026. So, the biggest rumor coming out of the combine was that Tennessee wanted to move back. They were not in love with any of these quarterbacks. But as they began to meet with Cam Ward at the combine and then all the other meetings that they have had with him, it seems like they've really fallen in love with him. They've been infatuated with him. I've been a huge fan of Cam Ward going back to that Florida game where he was just running all over the field and making miraculous throws. And every year we have that quarterback that really just catapults himself up the board. And Cam Ward has really been that guy this year. And I went back and forth about this so much, and I try to put myself in Mike Berganzi's shoes, the new GM there. And basically, I said, would he be comfortable in year 1 tying his tenure to any one of these quarterbacks, whether it's Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward? But it seems like he's comfortable doing that now. And all signs point towards Cam Ward being a number 1 overall pick. So I'm going to stick and pick and take the quarterback here.
I don't blame you at all. I actually watched that Florida game this morning. I come to the quarterbacks and just the draft process a little bit later than most. We're doing the quarterbacks later this week with me and Derek and Dane. So I watched that Florida game this morning, and I totally understand what you're seeing in that game. There is a lot to love about what Cam Ward is bringing to the table. We talked about this a little bit last week. Independent of the Cam Ward part of this, whether you like him at 1, if he's not going to be the quarterback for the Titans at this point, who is or who would be the quarterback for the Titans? You did your mock draft before free agency started. So in theory, you could land on a Sam Darnold. You could get a veteran quarterback. But the fact that now the dust has settled, they haven't chased anyone and they haven't even really talk to anybody. There haven't even been murmurs or rumors of them discussing anything with a veteran stopgap quarterback. It really does feel like, as the seats have started to get filled here, this feels like the most logical conclusion, even independent of whether Cam Ward is deserving of the number 1 pick. And I think more and more people are getting comfortable with the fact that he is deserving of that number 1 pick.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, when you go out and you beef up the offensive line like they have done, giving Dan Moore $82 million, which is another discussion for another day for a lot of people. You bring in a veteran stopgap and Kevin Zeitler, so you figure out that guard spot as well. And like you mentioned, they haven't done anything besides bringing in Brandon Allen as a backup to Will Levis. Who knows what happens with that situation, assuming that they do select Cam Ward. So I think you're spot on as far as they haven't done anything as far as addressing the quarterback spot, but they've been really aggressive with shoring up their offensive front, which to me, the signs point to where you can read the breadcrumbs leading us to really them taking a quarterback at number 1 overall.
I totally agree with that. The Kevin Zeitler one, to me, sends the most signal because that's a 1-year stopgap option. This is a team that's probably a couple years away from competing. You want a 35-year-old right guard if you know you need to protect a rookie quarterback, if you know you need to drop that guy into a good situation, and that's exactly what's happened. I want to talk with you a little bit more about Cam Ward as a prospect because we haven't dug into this a lot, so I'm curious just about how you see him compared to previous quarterback classes and then the rest of this class. Because I think a lot of people have framed this as a weak quarterback class. And compared to last year, I understand that. There aren't 7 guys that can go in round 1. Maybe there's 1.5 that can. But that doesn't mean that doesn't make Cam Ward a worse prospect, even if there are fewer quarterbacks we're taking in the first round. So as you look at him and you compare him to the sort of prospect that maybe, even if we get outside of the top 3 guys, a Michael Penix was, or a Bo Nix was, or even a guy like Jaden Daniels, what sort of quarterback do we think we're talking about here with Cam Ward in your estimation?
So I was on the Dominique Foxworth show about 2 weeks ago, and there was a viral clip that they posted saying that I would take Cam Ward ahead of J.J. McCarthy in last year's class. And for whatever reason, yeah, and I mean, for whatever reason, everybody's using last year's quarterback class as the standard, and I get it. Like, we had 6 guys go inside of the top 12, which is phenomenal, something that we had never seen before. But when I'm stacking those guys and I place Cam Ward in that tier, I still would have Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, and Drake May ahead of him as a prospect. But I like him more than I liked J.J. McCarthy coming out of Michigan last year. Just because you talk about the arm strength that he has, the poise that he plays with. But I just love quarterbacks that have that underdog mentality. And everywhere that he's been, he's changed the program, whether it's Incarnate Word, Washington State, and then most notably at Miami. But every time I look at Cam Ward, like, he just makes that extra play to help catapult them to victory. And I know a lot of that was his own wrongdoing in some games. But I look at the Cal game. I'm not sure if you watched the Cal game. He was not good at all in the first half of that game. Virginia Tech, which came down to the last second. In every single one of those games, he was just able to make that extra play to help them to victory. And something else you have to remember, he was playing against 2 defenses every week. He was playing against his own, which was giving up 40 points a game, and he was going against the regular defense. So he just fits the prototype in the modern day quarterback that we're looking at, whether it's, guys like who I consider the top 4 in the class, or excuse me, in the NFL this year: Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, and then Josh Allen. You could put them in any order that you want to. That's like the 4 guys at the top. I'm not saying Cam Ward is going to be in that tier, but he has a lot of the qualities that we like in all of those guys. And all those guys that I just named, these are the players he's going to have to beat in order to go to the Super Bowl. So do you feel like he has the traits, or the requisite traits, to eventually get you over the hill to beat those guys in the playoffs? So I think Cam Ward has the ability to be a high-level starter. But another thing that I'll add is he's going to have to go to a coach that understands how to straddle the line of letting him be him, but also have to rein him in a little bit as well. And then the player that I compared him to was Jordan Love, coming out of Utah State. And if you remember, he was a very polarizing prospect as well, just because everybody loved the traits with Jordan Love, but he just had a couple head-scratching plays per game where you were like, man, what the hell were you thinking on that throw? But that's kind of the thrill. That's kind of the intriguing part with Cam Ward. And if you think about guys that we see in the league every day that are playmakers like Mahomes and Josh Allen, they have a lot of those plays like what I call no, great job on that throw. So there's a lot of thrill when we're talking about the playing style of Cam Ward, and that's why I think Tennessee has really become intrigued with him with the number 1 overall pick.
Jordan Love is the first name that I would mention when watching him. And when I watched those 2 games this morning, again, it's my first real in-depth dive into who Cam Ward is. Just the way that he's moving around the pocket, both good and bad, right? There's a little bit of unnecessary pocket movement. He drifts a little bit. He's backpedaling a little bit. But you combine that with some of the creative stuff he can do as a thrower, and you get some of the good and some of the bad with who Jordan Love is. So that was the first comp that I would make. It's nice to hear somebody else say that. And the last thing I'll say about Tennessee and why I feel like even if we consider Cam Ward an imperfect prospect and maybe not the type of guy we typically see go number 1 overall at quarterback, especially when you compare it to some recent classes, if you're Tennessee, you got to do this at some point. You got to pull the trigger at some point on a future plan at quarterback. Who knows what's going to happen in 2026? You trade down to 3, you pick up some extra picks along the way. There's no telling that you're going to be in range to draft another one of those guys next year. And so running the risk of doing that, even if on a spreadsheet it makes sense because you need some more picks, I think there's a lot of downside in that decision. So them just doing this now, making sure they get it done because Ward clears the bar and is worthwhile of this sort of pick, I think it makes a lot of sense for where Tennessee is right now, even in year 1 of a new front office. Let's get to the Cleveland Browns. Now with Cam Ward off the board, the Cleveland Browns are on the clock at number 2. Here are your 3 options with the Browns. Option 1, draft Shedeur Sanders at number 2, or any quarterback. I'm gonna leave that door a crack open for you if maybe there's somebody else that you think is worthwhile there. Option 2, draft Abdul Carter, the pass rusher from Penn State. Option 3, you draft Travis Hunter. Nobody's trading up for this number 2 pick here. Nobody's making calls. So these are your 3 options for the Browns at 2. Which direction are you going?
I'm taking the quarterback. And I mean, it's simple. This regime has to win next year, man. And like I've been telling everybody, I think it's an easier pill to swallow if you win 5 or 6 games next year with a visible plan at quarterback in place, as opposed to you win 5 or 6 games next year with no visible plan at quarterback and you're stuck in this situation again. And there's no telling if you're going to be at the top of the draft, inside the top 3 or having the 2nd overall pick in next year's draft. And everybody likes to look at the next quarterback class, but we have no idea what's going to happen next year. So if I'm always in position to take a quarterback, I'm always going to take that guy. And if I think about it, like all the quarterbacks that Kevin Stefanski has had success with, even going back to his days in Minnesota, they're very similar to Shedeur Sanders. Those prototypical pocket passers that win with accuracy, really good ball placement. They can play from under center. They can play off of play action. Even though they're not overly great athletes, they have just enough ability to get out of harm's way. So I think Shedeur Sanders, he compares very, very favorably to some of the quarterbacks that he's had success with in the past. And I just think Cleveland has to take a quarterback. And I know Shedeur Sanders is not going to be the number 2 ranked player on anybody's big board at this point, in my honest opinion. But if you're in position to take a quarterback and you're Cleveland, I just don't see a scenario of where you can pass on a quarterback right here.
It's a very good argument and one that I haven't heard a lot of, this idea of, all right, if you're going to win 5 or 6 games anyway, is it easier to justify another year for the front office and the coaching staff if you have a rookie quarterback that you can say, all right, we're going to have some development into year 2. Like the arrow is pointed up. I know this wasn't good for the 2nd straight year, but give us another shot because we're building towards something rather than, we don't know who the quarterback is going to be again. That being said, and this is how I've laid this out, and this is how I talked about it with Dane last week, and I'll do the same thing for you and give you 2 more options. You can take Shedeur Sanders at 2 and then draft whoever the best prospect is available at 35. And whether it's an edge rusher, whether it's a receiver, whoever. This team has a lot of needs. Or you can take Abdul Carter at 2, who might be the best player in the entire draft independent of position, and you can take a quarterback, whoever's there at 35. Do you think there's any justification and any merit to that second option because of how good Carter is, and maybe because there's not that big of a gap between who Sanders is and the rest of this group of quarterbacks?
I think it just comes down to how closely you have Sanders, and let's just assume Jackson Dart is their third-ranked quarterback right now. If there's not a huge discrepancy between the two, then of course you go with Carter and then you take Jackson Dart at the top of the second round, or if you want the fifth-year option, you could trade up into the back end of the first round or wherever he is at that point. So I think it just comes down to how far of a discrepancy that you have between, or the differences, I should say, between their grades at this point. I don't have Jackson Dart graded that highly. I think he's more so of a late second, early third round pick, in my honest opinion. And I think it's just more so of a lack of supply and a lot of demand with these quarterbacks. And we see this every year in the draft. This guy just magically comes up the board, and I think Jackson Dart is that guy this year. So once again, it just comes down to how much of big of a difference that you have between the grades of Sanders and then also Dart.
How big is the difference for you? Like, do you have Shedeur Sanders definitively as a first-round player, or is he a little bit further down and you're just not quite as high on Dart as some other people?
I'm just not as high on Dart as some other people, but I do have Sanders late 1, early 2. That's the grade that I have. He's my 19th ranked overall prospect, so he's in that late 1, early second round range right now.
So that's not too bad. You taking your 19th rated prospect at number 2 overall if it's a quarterback, that's a bridge you feel comfortable crossing.
Yeah, and I mean, and I'll back up. So if this was Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry's first year, I think without a doubt they take Abdul Carter if he's there without question. But with the Deshaun Watson mess and everything that has created, and then also them having to win next year, I just don't see a scenario where they can pass on a quarterback. Just because when you have a quarterback, and let's say you win 5 or 6 games, you can go into Jimmy Haslam's office and say, hey, we have a visible plan at quarterback. Just let us see it through. Let us develop Shedeur Sanders, whoever they take. And now just let us see it through that point, as opposed to we have Abdul Carter, who's an amazing player, but we still have question marks at quarterback in 2026.
All right, I'm going to lay one more hypothetical out here for you, just because I think this is fun, okay? You're Andrew Berry. You call Terry Fontenot a week before the draft and say, all right, we are willing to trade you a 4th-round pick if you'll eat half of Kirk's base salary this year. So you're paying $13.5 million. When we trade for him, we'll convert that into a signing bonus. We'll make his cap hit $5 million, whatever it is this year. We'll spread this out. Kirk Cousins is our bridge answer at quarterback if we're Cleveland. The only way Kirk agrees to that is if you are not drafting a quarterback at number 2 overall or in the first round period. Are you open to that solution if you are Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski?
I'm not. Just based on how Kirk looked last year, post-Achilles tear, and then what we saw from him in that sample size that he did play, I just wouldn't feel comfortable having Kirk Cousins as my starter just because of how he looked from the sample size that we saw from him.
That's totally fair. I throw that out there because the Browns are also one of those teams where we're running out of options, man. We're at the Russell Wilson, Joe Flacco stage of this, and so throwing one more name into the mix to make it feel a little bit more appealing, I thought might get you there, but I understand going that direction. I think that they're in such a unique spot where they can't really afford anybody, where they don't have that many options. They may have to do something that smells a little bit like a desperation move, but they're in a spot where they might need a desperation move. So I can completely understand them going that direction if it comes to it.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see how you can be comfortable going into the year as Kirk. Based on what we saw last year, I wouldn't be comfortable going into the year with Kirk Cousins as my starter.
I think you need, no matter what happens here, if you're Cleveland, there needs to be a very clear and honest conversation with ownership before this pick happens about what the expectations are this year. Because I think you could sell it to the Haslam's where you say, listen, I understand we had a terrible season last year. I understand things need to get better. But it is the wrong long-term move for the Cleveland Browns for us to pass on a guy like Carter at 2 and take a quarterback just to do it. Let's just feel this out for another year. Let's get another elite player in the building. We'll find a solution at quarterback next year when there are better solutions at quarterback. Whether or not they buy into that plan is an entirely different discussion, but I think the conversation is at least worth having if you're Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski because of the unique circumstances that you're playing under right now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's the first thing that they should have had that conversation a few weeks ago when they were starting to build out their draft board. And I'm sure they did, just because I'm sure Abdul Carter is very high on their board. And there's going to be a huge discrepancy as far as their grade between probably the quarterbacks on here and then also Abdul Carter.
All right. At number 3, the New York Giants are on the clock. This is the first wrench that we've thrown into this. I had draft Shedeur Sanders as one of the options for the Giants. He's no longer involved. So here are your 3 choices. if you're the Giants. Option one, draft Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter, whichever one is left on the board. Both of them are left, so you can have your pick of either of them. Now, option two, draft Mason Graham, who I think went 5th overall in your most recent mock draft to the Jags. So you have him as a top 5 player, the defense tackle from Michigan. Option 3, because both quarterbacks are gone, I'm letting you choose your own adventure here. If there's a wild card that you would rather have than either Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter, you can make that pick here if you are the Giants. So which of those 3 options are you going with?
Well, just backtracking a little bit, perfect scenario is Shedeur Sanders falls to them, or they call Cleveland and they try to trade up for the quarterback one more spot. But in this scenario, I'm taking Travis Hunter. I think Travis Hunter is the best player in this draft, and I think this guy is like so rare, Robert. It's very rare to see a guy not only play one side of the ball and be so good at it, but also go to the other side and be just as good or even better at it as well. I have him as a cornerback, but he's so good, a lot of teams possibly see him as a receiver as well. And the only comparison that I can find for him, and I did this one before the season, was Champ Bailey when he was coming out of Georgia. And if you remember, Champ played over 100 reps his final year, each game, in the final 8 games of his final year at Georgia. So very comparable to Travis Hunter. He played, I believe he averaged 115 snaps a game this past season. But a scout put something to me that I thought was really interesting, in that a lot of people are saying that Travis can't play both ways, but he believes that he can, just because the tempo of the game is much slower in the NFL. And what he meant by that is teams are huddling much more periodically in the NFL. But if you think about it, in college, they're snapping the ball as quickly as they can. That's why his rep count was so high, and the tempo of the game was much quicker in college. Now, the speed of the game is obviously going to be different, and the NFL is going to be much quicker just because everybody is bigger, faster, stronger. But with everybody huddling up and the tempo of the game being slower, he possibly can play both sides of the football now. So I thought that was a really interesting quote that made me think about, or rethink a little bit about Travis Hunter playing both ways, just because I would play him at corner full time and sprinkle him in maybe 20 to 25 plays a game as a receiver. But that quote really made me rethink things a little bit.
I think that makes total sense. I think that is the easier way to do it. Just being in the defensive meetings, being a full-time defensive player, and then getting to moonlight as a receiver. You can correct me if I'm wrong about this. You know more about it than I would. At Colorado, they were signaling routes into him, correct? Isn't that a lot of how the mechanics of it worked for him to understand what he was supposed to do on offense, because his meeting time was full-time as a defensive player? So in the NFL, I'm really curious about that. Like, if he is going to be a full-time defensive player, and that's where his meeting time is going to be, what do the mechanics of him getting the information look like? Because even if you're huddling, is it a situation where, all right, you have Brian Dable on the headset, and he's talking to, I don't know, name your quarterback. I guess it's Russell Wilson in this situation. He's talking to Russ in the headset, and he's saying, we're, I don't know, ace, right, slot, whatever. And then Travis is lined up in the slot, and he's running a corner. Like, what does the actual communication process look like because of how limited the meeting time is going to be? The answer to that I'm fascinated by, and whatever team chooses him, how they land on just the distribution of his time and time management is going to be a really, really cool thing to parse through.
Yeah, that's a great point. But just to push back on that, now he's just worried about football. So I think if anything, he's going to have more meeting time than anything, and not really have to worry about, going to class and all these other things that are associated with college. So I don't think the meeting time is really going to be a big problem at all, just because he's going to have more time to allocate to the actual meeting space and the meeting room of everything. Now, on defense, I think it's a little bit more easier than offense per se, just because the terminology and the different routes that he would have to run, different concepts. With defenses, you really can just have somebody tell them, or, I've seen some teams in college keep that guy closest to their sideline and just signal in whatever the coverage is. So little things like that I've seen done with defenders.
With the Giants specifically, I think the plan of him playing corner and then playing a little bit of receiver makes sense based on the rest of their depth chart. Like, the Giants could still use another corner here. I mean, they signed Paulson Adebo in free agency, but Deonte Banks has been a little bit up and down. So I feel, and if you want to move Adebo inside potentially, whatever, even though Drew Phillips is there, how the room shakes out, I think that's going to be something they have to figure out. But in your mind, he's good enough that it doesn't really matter. You're taking him and then figuring the rest out later.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine the headache him and Malik Neighbors would cause. Like, guarding both of those dudes would be an absolute nightmare for defenses.
Let's get to the New England Patriots at number 4. Option 1 with the Patriots on the clock was, if available, draft Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter. That is obviously on the table for them, with Abdul Carter still being on the board. Option 2, draft Will Campbell or Armand Membu with the 4th overall pick. In this scenario, a little note here, the Patriots have not signed a left tackle in free agency. So there is a huge glaring hole for them at that spot. Option 3, because so many players are available here and I didn't want to box you in, is draft your front 7 player of choice for the New England Patriots. So among those 3 options, which direction are you going?
I think you go with Abdul Carter. You take best player available. And I think the most interesting thing about New England's offseason so far is that most of their resources have been allocated to the defensive side of the ball. I mean, they've signed Milton Williams. They signed Harold Landry. They signed Robert Spillane as well, Carlton Davis in the secondary. So they've spent a ton on the defensive side. They really haven't touched, outside of Morgan Moses, they really haven't touched the offensive side at all. So I think they're going to attack the offense heavy in the draft. But if somebody like Abdul Carter falls to you, I definitely think you have to take him at number 4 overall, just because this team is just starved for talent on both sides of the ball. And even though we don't have that high-end tackle prospect in this year's class, I think that's going to work in the Patriots' favor, just because there's no Joe Wald or anybody like that in this year's class. So I think there's going to be a player for them at the back end of the first round, or even at their pick in the earlier parts of the second round, that still could be there for them, whether it's somebody like a Ariante Ursary out of Minnesota that I think could be a starter within his rookie year. So you get Abdul Carter, you pair him along a defensive line with the Milton Williams and Harold Landry. Now you're starting to stack those players that you can build around. So, and I'm just thinking, like, building a defense around Abdul Carter, Milton Williams, Christian Gonzalez, Christian Barmore. Now we're talking like serious building blocks on this defense from a year ago that really was invisible, just because of the lack of talent that they had on the defensive side of the ball. So I would take Abdul Carter here without question, and then I will look to possibly move up into the back end of the first round, or just stick and pick at the top of the second round to address left tackle.
Other than the Minnesota left tackle, who are the other guys? Are there other 2, 3, 4 other names that you think might be available in the back half of the first, early second, that could be a potential target for a team like the Patriots, or another team that could use a left tackle in that range of the draft?
Josh Connerly out of Oregon is another name that definitely could be there. And lo and behold, Josh Simmons of Ohio State could be there, depending on how comfortable you feel about the patella tendon injury that he suffered in the 6th game against Oregon. And he reminds me of Christian Darrisaw when he was coming out. I think if he stayed healthy this entire year, I think he would be a bona fide top 10 pick. But because of the patella tendon injury that he had, that could cause him to slip down the board. But if you're New England, I definitely think that's a chance that you would definitely risk taking, just because you have no visible plan at left tackle right now. You passed on pretty much everybody in free agency. I thought they could entertain the thought of Cam Robinson, but it seems like they didn't even touch him at all. So, I mean, it's clear that they possibly like their options in the draft, and that's the route that they're going to go.
All right, so let's say we do that. Let's say we take Abdul Carter at 4 and then a left tackle either with a slight trade up, or you find one at 38 in the second round. If I'm a Patriots fan, I'm waking up in a cold sweat and having night terrors about who's going to catch the ball in these scenarios. They have 2 third-round picks. They're picking at 69 and 77. Is there a receiver that you feel like might be available in the 3rd round? I'm really making you go deep here. I'm making you do an entire Patriots mock draft live, but I'm testing you. Is there a receiver in the 3rd round that you think the Patriots might be able to find that you think makes sense for where they are right now?
Just pulling up my list here, some guys that I actually do like at the position. Kyle Williams from Washington State is one that I liked, even coming out of the Senior Bowl. I definitely think he could be in that 3rd or 4th round range. And that's why I really think the depth of this year's class is really like that 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round range. We don't really have, in my opinion, that bona fide top 10 or top 15 player like we have seen in years past. So he's one. Alec Ayo-Maynor out of Stanford is one that could go in the 2nd or 3rd round. And then also, if they're looking for a specialty receiver just to take the top off of the defense, Isaiah Bond out of Texas is definitely another name that I think is really interesting, that had some first-round buzz coming to the year when he transferred from Alabama to Texas, but was banged up this year and didn't have the year that he was hoping for. So he could be there inside of the top 75. So those are definitely 3 names. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they have to have somebody to catch the ball for Drake May, just because another position that they really didn't show any interest in anybody in the offseason.
So let's play this out a slightly different way, because I do want to talk about the tackles a little bit. This is the spot where we could do some of that. Let's say, in theory, Cam Ward, Travis Hunter, and Abdul Carter are off the board when the Patriots are picking, and they do end up zeroing in on one of those tackle prospects because of need and value. If you are on the clock at 4 and you are taking one of those two tackles for the Patriots, and that guy has to play left tackle for you, is it Will Campbell or Armand Membu, and why?
It's Armand Membu for me, just because I think he has the athleticism that you love to see at the position, and he's battle tested. Both have been in the SEC, of course, him and Will Campbell, but I just think the traits, the requisite traits to play tackle consistently, I just feel more comfortable with Membu doing that. He has the strength that you love to see at the position. He's really physical at the point of attack as a run blocker as well. But if there was one caveat to the Membu pick, is that he's never played left tackle before. So it would be a huge adjustment for him going over from the right side to the left side. So that may be the tiebreaker if they do elect to take Campbell over Membu. But for me, I think Membu is the better prospect overall. And I think he's a plug-and-play option at left tackle.
I'm trying to think of the last guy who did that. Jed Wills was a right tackle in college, correct? And then went over to play left tackle full-time for the Browns, so that would be an example. There's been a couple other ones recently. Who else was a full-time right tackle and then moved to the left side? And of those guys, like, what's typically the hit rate with something like that?
None immediately comes to mind. I know Joe Alt did the opposite last year, and he went on to play really, really well. But I can't think of one that, like, immediately comes to mind that went from right tackle to left tackle. Jed Wills was the last one that I immediately can think of. But outside of that, I can't think of anybody that went early that primarily played right tackle and then went over to the left side.
Yeah, well, the Patriots are going to need to find one somewhere here. So whether that's Membu,
you could count Tristan Wirfs. You can count Tristan Wirfs. You could say,
that's. I mean, he's played everywhere at this point. He's able to do a little bit of everything. Let's get to the Jacksonville Jaguars here. I put in italics at the top of this. For our purposes here, Hunter and Carter have already been selected. They have already been selected, so we don't have to worry about that with these three options. Here are your three options with the Jacksonville Jaguars on the clock at number 5. Option 1 is draft Mason Graham from Michigan, which I believe you did in your mock draft that you did before free agency started. Option 2, draft your edge of choice, dealer's choice, whoever you want. Whichever is your favorite edge player left now that Abdul Carter is off the board, you can do that. Option 3, some sort of wild card. With both tackles on the board, we can throw the tackles in there. If you wanted to go get a corner, maybe Will Johnson from Michigan, because of what the depth chart looks like for the Jags, that's available to you. So of those three options, Mason Graham, edge, or surprise me, which one of those routes are you going if you were the Jags at 5?
I'm sticking and picking, and I'm taking Mason Graham. And outside of Abdul Carter and then also Travis Hunter, he's the other blue chip player for me in this year's draft class. And I mean, he's gotten better every single year when he was at Michigan. I think he's a plug-and-play interior guy, whether it's one technique or three technique. I think he can play either one. Even though the weight was shocking to a lot of people at 296 pounds at the combine, he got up to 306 at his pro day, and he probably played somewhere from 310 to 315 during his final year, if I had to guess. But just the hand strength that he has. And, you know, when I'm going through these possible picks that these GMs could make, I really try to match some of the tendencies that they have. And if you think about it, James Gladstone and what he created with the Rams, they always take players that are ready to play right away. And if you go back to last year's draft, Jared Verse and Braden Fisk are two other great examples of players that we all knew that could come in and play right away. And I see that with Mason Graham. And if you just add him to Trayvon Walker, Josh Hines-Allen, Mason Smith, who showed some promise last season for them, the second-round pick a year ago, now adding Mason Graham along that interior to be that linchpin in the middle, I think that quickly becomes building a strength on a strength. And now we've seen with the Rams, they like to build from the inside out, and they like to have their defensive line as one of the strongest points of their entire team. So I could see Gladstone really investing into that defensive interior really quickly. That's why I took Graham right here.
It's such an interesting contrast because if you look at what the Jags have done, the Jags are drafted on potential more than those Rams front offices have. I mean, Trayvon Walker is obviously the best example, but it's traits, it's size, etc. And maybe we'll figure out production somewhere down the road. The Rams haven't really done that, so that contrast is interesting when you're thinking about this front office compared to the previous regime in Jacksonville. And even a guy with Mason Graham's sort of profile, if you think about some of the other players they have, even if they bump Eric Armstead inside, and now he's playing 3 technique in some of those 4 down fronts. You still need a nose tackle as part of that overall equation. And so having one more defensive tackle who's a stout player, maybe isn't quite as dynamic of a pass rusher as some of the other guys that you have, that probably makes more sense for the overall composition of the Jags front than it might make for some other teams who are looking for maybe more of a dynamic pass rushing force on the interior. So for the Jags specifically, based on what I understand about Mason Graham, I think it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does, without question. Like I said, just building a strength on a strength. And I'm looking at the offensive lines around my division. I'm looking at Houston, whose offensive line is in shambles right now as they've tried to remodel everything. The Colts just lost 2 of their anchors along the interior, and Ryan Kelly, and then also Will Fries. So if I continue to build up my defensive line, I think I have a clear advantage of some of the other offensive fronts in my division.
If Mason Graham is not on the board for the Jags and you're having to look at some other needs and just some other options for them, as you've thought about mock drafts and just who might be available at 5, or maybe they don't like Mason Graham, I mean, there's no way for us to know. What are some of the other things at top of mind for you about places and directions the Jags might go in the draft?
I think corner is definitely an area where they could look to go, just finding somebody opposite of Tyson Campbell. They've really struggled to find somebody opposite of that one. I know they signed Jordan Lewis here in the offseason, but he projects more as a nickel to me. And then also they have Jarian Jones, who they selected last year. So I'm really interested to see how the nickel dynamic works out for them. So that could be one area where I think they could serve to improve, but also guard. Guard is another area where I think they could look to upgrade. They signed Patrick McCarry in the offseason, but they could look to add some more depth there as well. So either guard or corner is another area. And then also receiver. I think receiver could be a very underrated need. And I know they signed De'Ami Brown, but he's more of a third guy to me, in my honest opinion. So I don't view any receiver in this class outside of Travis Hunter. Now, Travis Hunter is there. Obviously, you take him. But outside of him, I wouldn't be comfortable taking any of these guys inside the top 5. So if you trade back into the teens, like anywhere between 10 or 14, now you're talking about potentially Tetaroa McMillan, who I think would be a really good fit with Trevor Lawrence.
I was just looking at teams that potentially would want to move up to 5 if the Jags were to move down. Because then again, guys like Will Johnson, if you wanted a corner, Ted McMillan, if you wanted a receiver, if you wanted to trade even further back and try to find a guard in the middle of the first round. I'm just curious who would want to come up to 5 and who it would be for, though. I think that's the bigger question. Is there a prospect in your mind with Carter and Hunter off the board who would be worth trading up for if you're a team like the Panthers, the Saints, the Bears, the Niners, the Cowboys sitting there from 8 to 12?
I don't see it, honestly, and that's the most interesting part about this draft, in my opinion, honestly, just because the players that you're going to select pick 12 through pick 50 are basically going to be the same exact players, in my opinion. There's really, outside of Carter, Graham, and Hunter, there isn't that guy that you're just itching to trade up for in this year's class, in my honest opinion. Much different than what we saw in last year's group of where there was just studs after studs, not just the quarterbacks. I mean, guys like Brock Bowers and, Joe Alt, Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison, these dudes that you just knew could come in and play right away. This year's class isn't really like that. But if there is a defensive lineman that somebody really likes, whether it's a Jalen Walker or, a Michael Williams or somebody like that, that somebody could be itching to trade up for, that could possibly happen, but I just don't really see that in this year's class.
All right, let's round this out with the 6th and final pick of the first edition of this exercise for us. The Las Vegas Raiders are on the clock. Here are your 3 options for the Raiders. Option 1, draft Ashton Jeanty, running back from Boise State, with the 6th overall pick, which would be a very fun swing in year 1 of a new regime. Option 2 is draft your edge player of choice. Again, some of these, talented but maybe, not perfect edge prospects all still on the board here after Abdul Carter was gone. That is your second option. Option number 3, draft Ted McMillan, wide receiver from Arizona. You still need a receiver somewhere in the mix here if you are the Raiders. You have Jacoby Myers, obviously, but if you want a bigger outside the numbers option to go along with him and Brock Bowers, it does seem like McMillan might be your choice there. Among those 3 options, which one are you going with if you are John Spytek and Pete Carroll?
So before I make the pick, I think this pick comes down to one thing for me, and it's how high do you have Ashton Jeanty graded over the other running backs in this year's class? Just because if you have a very similar grade between just this scenario, Ashton Genty and then also Amari and Hampton, then I think you try like heck to trade back, or you take somebody else at this spot, whether it's a Tech McMillan, and then you come back in the second round and take somebody like a Travion Henderson or a Quinshon Judkins if you have them in that second round range. But if you have just a astronomically high grade on Genty, and he's head and shoulders above any other running back in this year's class, then you just go ahead and take him. Just because Pete Carroll's about to be 74 years old, man. He wants to win right now. So we want to get these guys that can come in and that can play right away right now. So I'm going to go with Ashton Genty right here just because I think that's what Pete is going to want to do. And I mean, you add Genty to Brock Bowers for Geno Smith. Now you have two building blocks along as far as weapons wise that I think can be really A-level players. We already know Brock Bowers is already an A-level player. He set every record imaginable for rookie tight ends. But Ashton Genty, man, he's just so special to me. He's that guy that can come in. You can build the running game around him. But an underrated part, and what a lot of people don't know about Genty, is that he was a receiver before he was a running back. And he was so good as a running back last year, they just strictly used him in that fashion. But he has untapped potential as a receiver. So you're not just getting a guy that can run the football. You're getting somebody that you can really incorporate your passing game around as well. And with Geno Smith, we know that he really likes to incorporate those type of players in that offense. So Genty, you can split him out wide. You can obviously use him in the backfield as a rushing threat as well. So you're not just taking a running back at this spot. You're taking somebody that you can use not only as a running back, but you can incorporate in the passing game as well.
So you have Genty at 4 on your overall big board for this year. So you think that he is that type of prospect. I totally get that. So even if it's not Pete Carroll or Spytek, if you're the one making the pick here, are you still taking Ashton Genty because of where you have him ranked?
I would not take Genty right here. I would elect to go. I would elect to go a different way. I would go whether it's a Tech McMillan, a Will Johnson, the corner from Michigan, or somebody of that area, just because the running back class is so deep. I would feel perfectly fine, like I said, getting somebody like a Quinshon Judkins or a Travion Henderson. I keep saying those two names just because of the Chip Kelly connection.
Sure.
And this could be the route that they absolutely go just because of the familiarity with both of those guys. So if it were me, I would go a different direction. I would look to go, whether it's a receiver or a corner or even an edge rusher or anybody like that. And then I would look to take the running back in the second round.
So you have Will Johnson at 5 on your big board. And if let's say they do pass on a Genty here, I still think corner is like a screaming need for the Raiders right now when you just sit there and look at the depth chart. So that would be appealing to you if maybe they don't love Genty as much, or because they think the running back class is so deep that we want to get the corner here. We'll figure out running back later.
And then also, if I'm John Spytek, I just saw what Bucky Irving was able to do in Tampa Bay as a 4th round pick.
Right.
So I originally mocked Genty, number 6 overall here, but just putting myself in Spytek's shoes and just seeing what Bucky Irving was able to do a year ago as a 4th round pick, that could give him some pause about taking a running back that early as well.
All right, so let's rewind a little bit here then. All right, so let's do this again. You're making the pick here.
Okay.
And
I got to give you an answer.
It's Genty. So you're making the pick here. It's Genty,
Yeah.
It's Will Johnson, or it's Ted McMillan. Which of those 3 routes are you going if you are making the pick here and you're the Raiders?
I would take Will Johnson. I just think even though he's been banged up throughout the pre-draft process, I think he's a very, very good cornerback prospect. And like you mentioned, we have such a huge hole at corner. I just think he could come in and really change the outlook of the position at that. And then also, whenever I'm comparing like stacking players, so for example, what I mean by that is, would I rather have Ashton Genty and somebody like a Azariah Thomas, who's a cornerback from Florida State, who's projected to be a 2nd round pick, or would I rather have Will Johnson and then a Quinshon Judkins? I would rather have the Quinshon Judkins stack along with Will Johnson as opposed to the other option. So I think that's something that they could weigh heavily in the draft room. And then also that's the exercise that I go through in my mock drafts as well that I always find really interesting. Just trying to put myself in the GM shoes of which stack of players in the first 2 rounds would you rather have?
Now I got to decide which of these answers I'm going to use as we do the rest of the first round. I think I might just stick Johnson there because it's more fun to still have Genty on the board as we go through all of these other teams. So I get to decide how this goes. We're making this up as we go along, so we get to decide which is more fun. So you have Johnson at 5. It feels like that was a name, again, as somebody who is not knee deep in the draft process or even in college football throughout the entire season. That's a name I was hearing even coming into the year as one of the prizes of this draft class. And it feels like some people have cooled on him a little bit as we've gotten a little bit deeper into the process. He didn't work out at the combine. He's not going to work out at his pro day, even though he is going to have a private workout, apparently, like you mentioned in your rankings before the draft. Why are you still so high on Johnson where it feels like maybe some other people have backed off a little bit?
So I always say every prospect is the greatest prospect ever until they're draft eligible. And whenever they have that draft eligible spotlight on them, that's when everybody starts to poke holes in them. And we see this with every prospect coming into the year that we've praised over the past 2 years. And I believe that's what's happening with Will Johnson. And like I said, he hasn't had a good pre-draft process just because we haven't seen him. He had the turf toe injury during the season. He only played, I believe, 4 or 5 games during the year. So he's been banged up. We haven't seen him at all since very early on in the season. And quite frankly, the tape wasn't very good early on this year just because he was very banged up during that time. So the last great game we've really seen him have was really back in 2023. So just with that, and then you stack all those things together, a lot of people are really starting to stack the negatives against Will Johnson. But when I go back and I look at the positives of this player that we praised during his freshman and then also his sophomore year, I mean, he was receiving Patrick Surtain, the second comparisons coming into the year. So it's like that guy, to me, didn't just magically disappear. He just doesn't have that momentum that he possibly could have created during the pre-draft process. And I'm not going to ding him for that stuff just because I think he's still a really good prospect. A really good prospect.
For some other people, it might be interesting to kind of rewind and do the Jags again with Will Johnson. If you had Will Johnson as your 5th overall player, most people, that might be a conversation for the Jags at 5. But because you have Graham at 3, it makes it a little bit less complicated. But I think there's probably some others out there maybe aren't quite as high on Mason Graham, but they're also probably not quite as high on Will Johnson. So what the Jags do at 5 will be an interesting kind of linchpin moment in this draft, just because, like you said, the elite players are probably off the board at that point. And then what the trickle-down effects of that look like, if it is Mason Graham, if it is the corner, et cetera, be very fun to watch. So the Genty watch and the Will Johnson watch here in the top 10 to 12 will be something we'll keep an eye on as we keep going through this exercise. Jordan Reid, sincerely appreciate the time, sir. Sincerely appreciate you helping us trot out this little exercise here that we're going to do over the next month or so. Please let people know where they can find you and the work that you were doing here in the month before we get to the draft.
Yeah, so you can find me on X, Twitter, whatever you call it nowadays at Jordan_Reid. That's JORDAN_REID. No, I am not the former Washington Commanders tight end. I get that on Twitter every single week, somehow, some way, even though he is now retired. You can also find my work on ESPN Plus as well. We're releasing mock drafts, player rankings. We're also releasing buzz files where we're sharing insider information, things that we're hearing as well. And then, going back and forth with these pro days, being able to talk to scouts as well, sharing things that I'm hearing from certain teams as well. So go on ESPN Plus. You can see all of that along with my colleagues, Mel Kiper Jr., Phil Yates, and then also Matt Miller as well.
Awesome. Sincerely appreciate the time. We will do it again very soon.
Thanks as always, Robert.
All right, guys, that's all we got for today. Thank you so much to Jordan for his time. We will be back with 2 more shows this week. Tomorrow, we're doing something a little weird. There was a conversation last week with a buddy of mine, Justice Mosqueda, talking about this idea of whether or not traits or production is more important for edge rushers and what actually is a bigger signal of success in the NFL. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. If you're drafting edge rushers, how much does production actually matter and how much of this is a traits-based position? That's going to be tomorrow's show with me, Justice, and Derek. And then on Thursday, me, Derek, and Dane are digging into this year's quarterback class. Very excited about that. So please be on the lookout for those shows. For now, that's all we got. Appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you very soon.